This lecture is part 4 in our Road to the Civil War and the final lecture in the causes of the Civil War. So we're going to focus on the political issues that led to the Civil War. So when we kind of left off in period 4, the Whig Party is one of our two major political parties, and you can see kind of this breakdown. We start with the first political party system with the Republicans of Jefferson and the Federalists of Hamilton. Then we get into Democratic Republicans of Jackson and the National Republicans with John Quincy Adams, and then we break off into Democrats and Whigs, and then eventually we get into our modern political party system between Democrats and Republicans. So what happens to the Whigs? Whigs grew more impassioned about ending slavery and more convinced that the National Whig Party would never take a strong stand against it. So they needed to kind of create, so we have a splinter group off the Whigs, so they created a new political party. So these anti-slavery Whigs joined Northern Democrats and formed the Free Soil Party, they were a single-issue political party that were effectively defeated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they wanted to make national politics about slavery. So the Whigs managed to win the election of 1848, kind of not necessarily the most significant election, where we get the nondescript military hero Zachary Taylor as our president. The Whig Party was on its way out due to the loss of its two leaders, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, who both passed away. And they have no leadership, kind of like the Federalist Party when Alexander Hamilton is assassinated. So in 1856, the Whigs did not even field a presidential candidate, and they're finished as a national party. So the remaining Whig members joined the Free Soil and formed the new party, the Republican Party. So it's made up of the remnants of the Whigs, and the Free Soil Party that was a breakoff of the Whigs originally. So in the late 1850s, the Republican Party was dedicated to keeping slavery out of territories, not destroying slavery, just stopping its expanse so that eventually it would die out. So it was kind of the gradualist theory that they are focusing on. So Midwestern merchants and farmers, Western settlers, and Eastern importers all joined this Republican Party, again made up of anti-slavery Whigs and Free Soilers, and it grows quickly in the North and would win a majority of congressional seats in 1854 from the North. So we have another new party that's going to be formed called the American Party. They were also known as the Know-Nothings because they met privately and remained secretive about their political agenda, and they rallied around a single issue, the hatred of foreigners. So this is not, obviously the first time, won't be the last time with our current president, where we focus on immigrants as a real problem, and an entire political party and a party platform is going to be dominated by the issues of foreigners. So the party grows quickly and dominated several state legislatures, and it spread some ugly anti-Irish, German, and Catholic propaganda. But as the Civil War kind of dawns, foreigners become a substantially less important issue until after the Civil War. So we start to see how politics is becoming even more violent when literally there is a man named Charles Sumner who was beaten at his desk in Congress by a different congressman named Preston Brooks because he gave an anti-slavery speech. So there was nobody really there when it actually happened, but the artist kind of added more people in the background to make it seem more extreme, but it is pretty extreme. The fact that congressmen, that politicians cannot stay civil enough to discuss an issue as important as slavery, it shows how divisive the issue was, and obviously is kind of a microcosm of what's going to happen in the larger Civil War. So in a smaller fight in national politics, we get the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates where Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate each other, and they ran against each other in the U.S. Senate for the state of Illinois in 1858. So the debates are followed and get some national recognition because the candidates were interested in running for the presidency in 1860. So people kind of looked at this midterm election as a possible big, who might the candidates be for the presidential election of 1860, and slavery is the main issue. So it kind of highlights the differences between the Republican Lincoln and the Democrat Stephen Douglas. So in these debates, Lincoln kind of shows himself to be a great writer. He wasn't necessarily a great orator because he had not necessarily the best voice, but when he speaks, the messages were well thought out. So he comes up with the house divided analogy, that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and we must become either one thing, all slavery, or the other, all free. He was against the expansion of slavery, but not slavery where it stood. Douglas believed that slavery would be decided by the people. That's why he's into the idea of popular sovereignty. In the end, Douglas actually wins the election, but Lincoln's speeches and debates earned him respect of many, and they saw him as a good presidential candidate. So they kind of remember that name 2 years later for 1860 when he runs as the Republican candidate. He's relatively not substantial in national politics prior to this, but this kind of puts him on the national stage, these very well-argued debates. But most people think that a little bit more of Lincoln than what he actually said. So in 1858, in his first debate with Douglas, he actually talks about, I am in favor of the race which I belong having a superior position. So he talks about white superiority. He wasn't necessarily thinking that all African Americans were equal to him, but he did think that it was immoral to have slaves. He says, I have never said anything to the contrary, but I hold that notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he says they should be free and have access to those rights, but he says that the white race is still superior. So the Democratic Party is also having issues because we have Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Stephen Douglas came up with the Freeport Doctrine, which said slavery could be prevented from any territory by the refusal of the people living in that territory to pass laws favorable to slavery, meaning he's still going with the idea of popular sovereignty. He said, likewise, if the people of the territory supported slavery, legislation would provide for its continued existence. However, it fails to please the whole party because any position that did not support the Dred Scott decision and the expansion of slavery was opposed in the South. So we start to see a major split in the Democratic Party over the issue of slavery. So as we get closer to 1860, we get our 4 presidential candidates because the Democrats split for North and South. So the Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats backed a man named John Breckinridge. There's a new party formed in the Upper South, so in like Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, called the Constitutional Union Party, and they support a man named John Bell, and the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln wins the election, but if you look at the electoral map, he wins only northern and then western states with Oregon and California. But he wins a substantial amount of the vote. You can obviously see that Stephen Douglas wins a substantial amount of the popular vote, but not a substantial amount of the electoral vote. So immediately after the election, Southern leaders who wanted to maintain the Union tried to negotiate a compromise. However, they go to Lincoln and say, if you soften your demands on slavery, maybe we can, we can work something out. He says, no, I'm not going to work with you on the idea of the new territories, all those territories listed there, must be free. So he doesn't soften. He had no other political option, as to do otherwise would have been an abandonment of the principles of those who supported him. He had to, as the Republican candidate, that was their main idea, that the new territories could not have slavery. He was not going to be eligible to do that. So this basically ends the possibility of a compromise between North and South prior to the Civil War. So as we fail to compromise, and you can see that the South, they would argue, had a legitimate argument saying he's not my president because no Southern states voted for him. He does not win a single one. So in December of 1860, 3 months before Lincoln is even inaugurated, South Carolina decides to secede from the Union. Within 7 months, 7 states join South Carolina to form eventually the Confederate States of America, and the states choose Jefferson Davis to lead the Confederacy as their presidency. So the fear that we have had for many years, even going back to 1776 and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, has finally come true, that the South has left the country. So as Lincoln eventually takes office in March of 1861, he does decide that he was trying to maintain control over federal forts in the South while waiting for the Confederacy to make the first move. That way he could kind of blame them for anything that went wrong. So on April 12, 1861, the South attacks and captures Fort Sumter in off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. No one died, and it's ironically in the first battle of America's bloodiest war, the Civil War. So the Fort Sumter attack on April of 1861 is the beginning of this war. So we see on this map, as we approach the Civil War, kind of the divide between what states are for secession. You can see that there were votes, of different areas of the states that voted for or against secession. What you'll notice if you look at Virginia in the upper left-hand corner of Virginia, most of that votes against secession, and eventually we get a new state called West Virginia because they did not want to leave the Union. So we get some interesting things here. The free states are those pink states, the North, the Union. We get the first states to secede are in the lower South, so we break the South into two sections because they were definitely more strongly associated with slavery, not willing to give it up. The second set of secessionist states are the Upper South, and the Upper South provided a natural border between the two belligerents, and the loyalty of these states represented an important milestone in the Confederacy and the Union. Some states went Union, some states went Confederacy, and you see those border states, those green states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, are known as the border states. They served as kind of a buffer as well because they had slaves, but they did not want to go and secede from the country. So we see kind of a differentiation between it's not just all the states that seceded versus all the states that stayed. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. So for many, as the Civil War is upon us, it was not primarily about slavery. Except for abolitionists, most Northerners believed that they were fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the country together. Most Southerners felt that they were fighting for states' rights to govern themselves. Most of the people in the North who fight will be, middle class or poor Northerners. Almost all of the Southerners who fight are going to be poor whites. So they weren't fighting for slaves because they didn't have slaves themselves. Many on both sides thought that slavery was simply the issue that had caused the argument over states' rights, and it was the main issue that caused the argument, but it's not the main issue at hand, which was states' rights versus federal supremacy. Even Lincoln says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all slaves, I would do it. He doesn't really care about slavery. He's more concerned with preserving the Union. That will eventually change as we get later into the Civil War, but it's important to realize at the beginning, it's not about slavery for most people.